And then you are outside.
Electricity Minister Khosiyan Suramokgopa giving a briefing at the Union Buildings this morning with regards to our power crisis in South Africa and trying to give us a forecast of how things will look, especially in winter. You might know that we are currently on stage 4 and 3 load shedding, and a lot of people have been imagining how it's going to look like in winter. He went beyond winter. He did say that winter is going to be quite a tough month because, as you know, a power station such as Kusile, out of 6 units, only 3 are operational, 3 are down. Medupi is even worse. Out of 6 units, only 5 are currently working. And you might remember that at the Kuba power station, that power station had to be switched off. A large part of it had to be switched off around October last year for planned maintenance, and it only is supposed to come back onto the grid with about 2,000 megawatts of power only later this year. So what he's saying about the Kusile power station is that out of the 3 units that are currently out of service, 2 of them will come back onto service in December this year. 1 of them will come back in November. That will give us about 2,160 megawatts of power. And he says that means an elimination of 2 stages of load shedding. But that's only in the festive season later this year. It still puts us under high risk when it comes to the winter season. What's interesting is what he said about the Kendal power station. He still has to meet with cabinet, he says, to discuss environmental versus power crisis and economy affairs. He says they can bring back about 1,000 megawatts of power from the Kendal power station, but it would mean that they need to be exempted by the Environmental Affairs Department because environmentally there might be some constraints there. So he needs to just discuss with his colleagues what they choose, whether they choose making sure that winter doesn't see stage 6 to 8 load shedding, or we see stage 6 to 8 load shedding, but we don't put much pressure on the environment. Well, staying with news around Eskom, as you may already know, the electricity state of disaster has been lifted. It was lifted yesterday. Government announced the decision in the afternoon, but this leaves many questions unanswered, one of them being what happens to the budget allocated to it. Let's try to get an idea from corporate governance advisor Professor Peter Goss. He is with us in studio. Prof, thank you very much for joining us. It was quite interesting to actually listen to this briefing throughout the time that you have been here. But first of all, let's discuss the fact that yesterday the finance minister announcing that he's withdrawing the Gazette to exempt Eskom from the PFMA for now. Are you concerned about those 2 words?
I'm concerned about the for now. I'm also concerned about the process, the governance process around it. You might recall that when this was first announced, Eskom went to media saying we now have got this reprieve. What's fascinating is we had a public furor, and suddenly the minister then goes to media and tries to quell the furor, then further goes on to terminate this particular position. Thereafter, you see, he meets yesterday with the Auditor General. The Auditor General gives a positive nod for the movement of removal. Let's go to the fundamentals. Eskom should have a strong stewardship grading to maintain its place in the marketplace as a well-governed organization. What is stewardship grading? Social responsibility. I don't see where a minister fits in explaining what the Eskom board announced to manage its position around the PFMA and reporting certain matters. Material losses as a result of criminal conduct. That's the reprieve they were given. They no longer need to report that in annual financial statements. I don't know where a minister fits in explaining how he'll remove that reprieve when the board announced we got the reprieve for the purposes of looking after Eskom. I think the Eskom board owes the public an explanation for what it will now do that it doesn't have the reprieve anymore. So this is an important issue. As for the reprieve itself, the removal of this temporary removal of this particular condition, I don't think it's temporary. I think they're going to come back and sneak it in the back door. Because this reprieve has been given to other state-owned entities. One in particular, we know the one, Transnet in particular,
Transnet,
for example. Here's my big dilemma. Imagine if this reprieve were given to all state-owned companies. That's the terrifying thought. Because all state-owned companies have to borrow.
Yes.
Where they borrow should not change the position of what they disclose to those who borrow their money, who lend their money. It should always be transparent no matter what your circumstances. He again goes on yesterday and he says, no, but Eskom doesn't need to borrow for 3 years for various reasons. And then we get a contradiction of it does not need to borrow any further. I think it doesn't matter whether it has to or it doesn't have to borrow. It has to still maintain debt covenants. The conditions on which it got those debt covenants include the condition of the annual financial statements which contained disclosures.
Yeah.
Removing those disclosures needs to be settled with the covenant. I don't know what covenants say about that particular disclosure. Just simply removing it for 3 years doesn't make any sense to me from a governance perspective. So the Eskom board owes more explaining to do than a minister who is not the head of Eskom.
You see, but that's also the other problem, and I don't know in terms of your space, in terms of governance, if that's where the bigger problem is. We're not really sure who runs Eskom, right? We have, for instance, 2 ministers, Minister of Public Enterprises, Minister responsible for Energy, Gwede Mantashe. Then you have the new Minister of Electricity who is in the presidency, meaning that the president is also involved in somehow in running Eskom. Then you have an acting CEO who also is the CFO of Eskom. So, and then the board. You're saying the board is what owes the public, an explanation. So who really runs this power utility? Who really do we get answers from?
That's the alarming challenge we have with state-owned companies. With the state conveniently being shareholder and conveniently these representatives of the state behaving like they're not shareholder, behaving like management sometimes. I believe that the behavior we've had now with this reprieve that's been given is blurring the lines. It is for the Eskom board to come clean with those who have lent it money, institutional investors, and those where it trades its bonds. Institutional investors and other investors. Come clean with them, explain the context for this. It does not cut it to say that it's simply a matter of convenience. You can't have a potential material financial misstatement. Not stating can be misstatement. And simply fold your arms and say, no, I've removed that condition for a short while. I'll put it in another report. I'll put it in the annual report. If you read the PFMA section 54, when it speaks about reporting, annual reporting and annual financial statements reporting about this matter, material losses as a result of criminal conduct, irregular, fruitless and wasteful expenditure, is in one clause. You can't separate the 2 titles.
Yeah.
So you've got to report consistently in those 2 reports. The reprieve is not well thought out. That the Auditor General appreciates that this has been done and withdrawn is, for me, an indication of how flawed the step was in the first place. That they will now, apparently, like the Transnet scenario, consult with the Auditor General before making this move. I'm concerned about. The average company does not consult with its auditor to run its business. The average board runs its business.
And then
legally,
the auditor comes in
within the 3
to check the
confines,
books.
exactly. What are the 3 confines for a public interest entity like Eskom? 1, the Auditor General will audit the financial statements. The Auditor General will audit compliance. The Auditor General will audit performance in relation to what they call predetermined objectives. So compliance will be audited with or without this. They don't need a blessing from a minister to say, we need your thoughts about our decision to give Eskom a reprieve in terms of what it may or may not disclose in its financial statements.
Yeah.
These 3 things will be audited whether they're disclosed or not disclosed. And the evidence behind the disclosure in any other instrument delivered by Eskom for its corporate reporting will still be audited.
Yes.
I don't know where the auditor comes in a discussion with a board about in advance whether the board should get a legal reprieve. It's the board's decision to govern Eskom, not the auditor's decision to govern Eskom, not a minister's decision to govern Eskom.
But doesn't this then also raise concern that a lot of people have been raising about whether or not the South African government actually knows what it's doing with the electricity crisis? Because you're saying that they're missing a step. And of course, you're right. In many companies, they do their business of the day or business of the year until the Auditor General comes at the end of the financial year to check the books and see if it balances, and they must explain what decision was taken then, etc. So to say that you're going to consult her now after you had gazetted the reprieve and now you know what I mean? So doesn't it also raise the concern that South Africans have been raising about whether or not we have leaders who know what they're doing in terms of sorting out this crisis?
And who know their place. We must separate the workings of governance. Shareholders in corporate governance don't have the right to run companies. Companies are run by boards, governing boards in governance. The law even creates a governing board for Eskom, and it runs Eskom. It decides whether it needs support from the law, from regulators, in relation to various matters. It handles those reprieves, if there were reprieves to be secured in relation to laws. But those reprieves can't be so convenient as to counter the fundamental principles of governance. A fundamental principle of governance is reporting and disclosure for transparency and accountability.
Yeah.
Done by who? A thing called ethical leadership. Who's that proxy? It is done by the board to deliver on ethical leadership. Major questions here around ethical leadership.
Let me ask you one last very unfair question, and I'd understand if you want to be careful with how you answer it. Was it a coincidence that on the same day we find out that the national state of disaster is being lifted, is the same day we find out about the reprieve? Because remember, when the national state of disaster was announced, it was announced a couple of months after that grand plan by the president last year on how to deal with our power crisis. He spoke about eliminating red tape, and the national state of disaster makes funds available quicker, right, for an issue to be sorted out. And then this is gazetted last week, Friday, and then on the same day, no, national state of disaster is lifted, we're withdrawing the gazette.
I don't share any insight. I don't have any insight into the circumstances of the
Because we
lifting.
all thought that maybe the gazette went through, the government gazette went through last week about the reprieve within the national state of disaster, because now changes must be made financially at Eskom to sort out the problem.
I didn't see it that way, I must tell you. I do have a view on the national state of disaster, though.
Yeah?
The days counted are in the region of 36 days or so. And in 36 days or so, I think the governance question must be from the Eskom board. What decisions did you make pursuant to the state of disaster? That's the beautiful question for me. Because that will tell us whether the state of disaster served its purpose. We have lots of contradictions about whether or not the state of disaster served this purpose.
Yeah.
One of the contradictions we have by a public official on the news this morning, the radio news this morning, was that we were imminently in a stage 7 or 8.
Yes.
And therefore we had a state of disaster. I think they should think deeper than making casual comments like that without. And this was a person that's
Especially
deputy
because they were
ministerial
denying
level.
ever putting us on stage 7 and 8.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for speaking to us, Prof, and thank you for coming into studio and he spent an hour with us here in studio listening to the Minister of Electricity and the plans that he has in terms of winter and what's going to happen later this year. Professor Peter Goss, Corporate Governance Advisor.